Back in Blighty, a soldier's first loyalty was to his regiment, and even the most reluctant conscript was conscious of belonging to something special. He could call himself a Devon, an Argyll, a Gloucester, or a Middlesex, and take some pride in belonging to the Bloody 11th, the Thin Red Line, the Back-to-Backs, or the Diehards, as those regiments were nicknamed. We were the Border Regiment, known among other things as the Reivers, and we were part of the Black Cat Division which took and held the stronghold of Mechtillah behind the Japanese lines in Burma early in 1945. It was there I learned that on active service the loyalty narrows down to the infantry section of 10. In practice the strength was more likely to be about 8, but whatever its size, the section was the private soldier's military family. Those 7 or 8 other men were his constant companions, waking, sleeping, standing guard, patrolling, marching and fighting, and he got to know them better, perhaps, than anyone in his whole life except his wife, parents and children. Within the section he would have his own immediate comrade, his mucker, known in some units as oppos or mates. My first mucker was the section leader, Corporal Little, no doubt because at 19 I was the youngest and least experienced member of 9 Section. Like most of the battalion, he was a Cumbrian, which is to say he belonged to one of the hardest breeds of men in Britain, with warfare bred into them from the distant past, when the Cumbrians lived by raid, cattle theft, extortion and murder. In war they were England's vanguard, and in peace her most unruly and bloody nuisance. They hadn't changed much in 4 centuries either. Little, known inevitably as Titch, just as I, the only Scot, was Jock, was lean, dark and wiry, speaking seldom and then usually in the harsh, derisive fashion of the border. An outsider would have marked him down as a dangerous customer, which he was. He was also, when least expected, as gentle as a nurse. Nixon was small, sprightly and wicked, with his own line of cheerful pessimism. His paddock cry of, "You'll all get killed," was rendered in the wail of a mueddin at prayer, and one thing no one doubted: whoever got killed, it wouldn't be Nick. That's not a criticism, he just had survivor written all over him. Grandarse, as his name implies, was on Falstaffian lines, red and hearty and given to rich oaths. He was a famous wrestler, and the wrestlers of Cumberland have no peers anywhere, and in civilian life had been a forester and spent his spare time rescuing climbers in the Lake Mountains, and never got a penny for it, the buggers. Forster was a fly man, crafty, foul-mouthed, ignorant and dishonest. Sufficient to say that in a battalion of expert scroungers, Forster was gifted beyond the ordinary. There are Burmese villages which must be wondering still where their pigs and chickens got to in 1945. Steele was a Carlisle boy, tough and combative and noisy, and something of a friend of mine, even if he did use the word Scotch to me with occasional undue emphasis. Once he added bastard. There was no racial relations legislation in those happy days, and I responded with a fist. We battered each other until Corporal Little, who was half our size, knocked me down and half-strangled Steele before dragging us face to face. "No shake hands! Barmy buggers! You'll have enough fighting with Jap, never mind each other. Go on, shake hands!" Confronted by that raging lightweight, we shook with a fairly ill grace. Then, being a skilled man-manager, he put us on guard together. Stanley was large and fair and quiet, and for sheer cold courage I never saw his like. He might have had a decoration, but his heroism manifested itself in a lonely place, by night, and no one in authority ever knew. Watty, a seasoned veteran, was nevertheless the only case I ever knew of what I believe is now called post-battle trauma. It happened when he woke one night convinced that we were surrounded by hundreds of Japanese only 18 inches tall, and led by his Member of Parliament, Sir Walter Womersley, Minister of Pensions. The kind of thing that would call for psychiatric reports and counselling by social workers nowadays. We simply advised him to take his cookery to them, which he did, cleaving the air and crying, "Pensions, you old bugger!" before going back to sleep. He was entirely normal for the rest of the campaign. The Duke was so called from his refined public school accent and a manner which grew more supercilious in proportion to the rank of the person he was addressing. He was almost humble to Corporal Little, but I heard him talk to a brigadier as though the man were the veriest trash. The rumour ran that he was related to the royal family, but informed opinion was against this. Grandarse had seen him in the showers back in India, and had detected no sign of a birthmark. Parker was a dapper, barrel-chested cockney, and that rare bird, a professional soldier of fortune. He was in his 40s, had got into the tail of the First World War, served as a mercenary in China, South America and Spain, From a pungent comment on the International Brigade, I deduced he had been with the Nationalists. Re-enlisted in 1939, came out at Dunkirk and been with 8th Army before being posted east. I'd first noticed him on the dusty long haul by troop train across India, at the end of a marathon game of 9-card brag in which I had amassed the astonishing sum of 800 rupees, about £60, which was money then. I was just wondering how to quit in the face of the chagrined opposition, which included various blue chins and hairy chests of Australian, American and mixed origin, when Parker, who had been watching but not playing, leaned over, picked up my winnings and stuck them inside his shirt. "That's your lot, gents," he said cheerfully. "Ease out." There were menacing growls, and a large individual with a face like Ayer's rock rose and demanded who said so. "I bleedin' do," said Parker. "I'm his uncle, and you've had a fair shot, so you can brag your bullocks off all the way to Calcutta, by yourselves. Ease out, see?" To me he simply said, "Better let me look after it," which he did for the rest of the journey, and I never even thought of asking for my money. Some people are fit to look after a small fortune east of Suez, and some aren't. One result of his mother-hen behaviour was that I learned something of his background. He was an orphan, and the proceeds of 20 years freelancing had put his younger brother through medicine. I said my parents had wanted me to be a doctor too, and he gave me a hard stare. "You didn't make it? Why not?" "Not clever enough, I suppose." "Too bloody lazy, more like. Idle little sod." "Well, I didn't want to be a doctor. I wanted to get into the army, try for a commission." "Did you now? Stupid git. Well, have you applied?" "Yep. Selection board turned me down. I've been busted from Lance Jack, too." "Christ, some mothers don't half have 'em. An educated sod like you. I seen you doing bleeding crosswords. Well, I shall just have to kick you up the arse, young jock. I can see that. Never mind. With my permission, you'll get a commish." He liked the sound of that, and it became a private slogan whenever the going got uncomfortable. If I was sodden through or bone-tired after digging in or standing to all night, and even when we went in under the guns at Piobi, Parker's raucous cry would be heard, "Bash on, jock! With my permish, you'll get a commish." It was as regular as Nick's "You'll all get killed," and just about as encouraging. So that was 9 Section, and if they sound like the cast for a war movie, I can't help it. That is how they were, and whatever I learned about soldiering, I learned from them. 10 men in bush hats and jungle green with 1,000 rounds of .303, 20 grenades and a Bren gun among us, each armed with an old Lee Enfield rifle, bayonet and kukri. Probably the most lightly armed and unencumbered foot soldiers since the introduction of firearms into war. A historian has said that 14th Army was stripped to the belt, and certainly it took makeshift for granted and relied on what it could carry and what was dropped from the air. And those desperate months in the northern hills and jungles, before my time, had bred in 9 Section an aptitude for something close to guerrilla warfare. Mostly we were just part of the battalion, but sometimes, when the section was on its own, on a long patrol, the scout to an outlying village, the lying up in a ruined temple, the ambush, you had a sense of being part of a Riva foray, and felt that if the army had vanished and had been left alone in that wild country halfway to China, they'd have damned the government, had a smoke, and carried on regardless, picking up this and that on their way back to India. Later in the campaign, having attained the dizzy height of Lance Corporal, I had nervous charge of those 7 or 8 old sweats, watching with interest to see what the young idiot would do next, and reminding me with gloating obscenity that I wasn't old enough to vote at the forthcoming general election. It was a reminder that I hadn't been trained for authority in eccentric warfare, but to be an obedient cog in the highly disciplined machine that was launched into Europe on D-Day. That would at least have been in civilized countryside, in a campaign whose essentials had been foreseen by my instructors. It's disconcerting to find yourself soldiering in an exotic oriental country which is medieval in outlook, against a barbarian enemy given to burying prisoners up to the neck or hanging them by the heels for bayonet practice, among a population who would rather turn bandit than not, where you could get your dinner off a tree, be eaten alive by mosquitoes and leeches, by handmade cheroots from the most beautiful girls in the world, with Granny watching, rolling the tobacco leaf on her scrawny thigh, wake in the morning to find your carelessly neglected mess tin occupied by a spider the size of a soup plate, watch your skin go white and puffy in ceaseless rain, the like of which no Westerner can imagine, and find yourself taken aback at the sight of a domestic water tap because you haven't seen one for months. It was a terribly old-fashioned kind of war. That's not an attempt to suggest special hardship, but you did feel the isolation, the sense of back beyond. Perhaps that came in part from being called the Forgotten Army, a colourful newspaper phrase which we bandied about with derision. We weren't forgotten by those who mattered, our families and our county. But we knew only too well that we were a distant sideshow, that our war was small in the public mind beside the great events in France and Germany. Oh, God, I'll never forget the morning when we were lined up for an attack, waiting in the sunlight, fixing bayonets, when a solitary Spitfire came roaring out of nowhere and victory rolled over us. We didn't get it. And while we were wondering, an officer, he must have been a new arrival and a right clown, ran out in front of the company and shouted with enthusiasm, "Men, the war in Europe is over!" There was a long silence while we digested this and looked through the heat haze to the village where Jap might be waiting. And I'm not sure the officer wasn't waving his hat and shouting hip hooray. And then someone laughed, and it ran down the extended line in a great torrent of mirth, punctuated by cries of, "Get the buggers out here! And have you told Tojo, Lake? And hey, son, is it all right if we ganyam?" Ganyam is go home in Carlisle. He must have been new and yet to get his priorities right, but it was an interesting pointer. But if we resented and took perverse pleasure in moaning, as only Cumbrians can, about our relative unimportance, there was a hidden satisfaction, too. We knew we were different and that there were no soldiers quite like us anywhere. Partly it sprang from the nature of our war. How can I put it? We were freer and our own masters in a way which is commonly denied to infantry. We were a long way from the world of battle-dress serge and tin hats, and the huge mechanized war juggernauts and the waves of bombers and artillery. We were unique, and I don't give a damn who knows it. We were 14th Army, the final echo of Kipling's world, the very last British soldiers in the old imperial tradition. I don't say we were happy to be in Burma, because we weren't, but we knew that General Slim was right when he said, "Some day you'll be proud to say, I was there." Mind you, as Grandass remarked, we'd have to get out of the bloody place first. "Hey, Jock, you any good at arithmetic?" "Not much, Sergeant, I'm afraid." "Well, max no matter. I'll keep the rate. Now then, how many fellas is there in British Army?" "Gosh, I don't know. 5 million?
"And how many of them's in Burma?"
500,000, maybe.
"And how many of them's in this battalion?"
About 1,000.
"And how many of them's in 9 section?"
10, Sergeant.
"So if you're in Army, what's the odds against being in 9 section? Take time, no?"
"I haven't the least idea."
"You can bugger. I'll tell thee. It's 500,000 to 1.
"If you say so. I'm fascinated."
"You will be. You're a section scout, aren't you?"
"I am, and I begin to see where your elaborate calculation is leading, Sergeant."
"Shut up and charge your magazine. No, 17th Div's ahead of 14th Army, and this battalion's leading 17th Div, and 9 sections out in front, further south than any other buggers in Southeast Asia Command. Are you following this, Jock?"
"With interest. Sergeant Hutton, do you know what a sadist is?"
"By Jock, you're a lucky young fella. The odds against being the leading man in the whole bloody war effort against Japan is 5 million to 1,
and I'm the one. Thank you very bloody much.
So keep the sellout on point. Keep your eyes open and think on. Me and Churchill's watching you."